every Australian childhood from 1913 to 2026. The Violet Crumble in the school lunchbox, the Polly Waffle at the milk bar, the Bertie Beetle in the Easter show bag. All three products came from one Melbourne company, Hoadley's Chocolates, founded by a Sussex-born Methodist jam maker named Abel Hoadley, Australia's first chocolate empire. 13th of April, 1988. London Stock Exchange, 9:15 in the morning. Swiss rival Jacobs Suchard launches a dawn raid on Rowntree Mackintosh, the British company that had bought Hoadley's in 1972. By June, Nestlé wins the counterbid, £2.55 billion. The largest foreign takeover of a British company in history at that time. The Hoadley name disappears from Australian confectionery. Polly Waffle discontinued 2009. Violet Crumble sold to Robern Menz 2018. Polly Waffle Bites relaunched 2024, rated 1.3 out of 5. How did Australia's first chocolate empire vanish into a Swiss portfolio? Before we go any further, if you want to keep these stories alive, I've created a book with the complete Australian lost factories, the workers, the gates, the Australian made, all gone. The link is on the first line of the description. Back to the story. Chapter 1, 1.3 out of 5, 2026. Walk to any Australian supermarket confectionery aisle. Look for Polly Waffle, not the original log that was discontinued 16 years ago. Look for Polly Waffle Bites. Polly Waffle Bites was relaunched by Adelaide's Robern Menz on the 22nd of April 2024. Small chocolate-coated wafer marshmallow pieces. Not the log format. Not the 1947 Mayfield B. Anthony original recipe. Different format entirely. Aggregate rating on productreview.com.au, 1.3 out of 5. Australian reviewer verbatim. As someone who had the real Hoadley's Polly Waffle in the 60s and 70s, I can say this is nothing like it at all. Another Australian reviewer verbatim. The only thing they have in common with the Polly Waffle bar is the name, do not recommend. The original Polly Waffle, the log format with waffle wafer, marshmallow filling, compound chocolate coating in a purple wrapper, was discontinued by Nestlé Australia on the 23rd of November 2009. 62 years after conception. Nestlé Australia spokesperson Fran Hernon told the Herald Sun, verbatim, "It's costing more to produce than what we get back in sales. The time for it has been and gone." The Violet Crumble, Hoadley's flagship product, credited to 1913, was sold by Nestlé Australia to Adelaide's Robern Menz on the 11th of January 2018. Undisclosed sum, Adelaide Manufacturing, Australian ownership. Nestlé Australia remains committed to Kit Kat, Milky Bar, Allen's, Soothers, not to Hoadley heritage products. The Bertie Beetle survives, but is now made in New Zealand, sold at Easter and country shows in show bags. The Hoadley name, as the Australian corporate parent, disappeared from Australian shelves after 1988, when Nestlé of Vevey, Switzerland, completed the largest foreign takeover of a British company in history, £2.55 billion for Rowntree Mackintosh. Australia's first chocolate empire became one-line item in a global Swiss portfolio. Read that again. £2.55 billion. April 1988. The transaction that dissolved the Hoadley name from Australian confectionery. This is the story of how a Sussex-born Methodist jam maker built Australia's first chocolate empire in Melbourne over 4 decades, and how it was erased across 4 more decades of foreign consolidation, discontinuation, and imperfect revival. Chapter 2. Rising Sun, Rewind, 1865, Melbourne, Port Phillip Bay. A 21-year-old Sussex-born baker's and blacksmith's son named Abel Hoadley arrives in Australia aboard the Essex. Unassisted immigrant, Sussex to Port Phillip Bay. Born 10th of September 1844 in Willingdon, East Sussex, England. son of Peter Hoadley, blacksmith, and Elizabeth Ann Hoadley, née Wheeler. Devout Methodist family, rural East Sussex origins, marries Susanna Ann Barrett in 1868. They have 14 children over the next 30 years. By the 1880s, Abel Hoadley has established himself in Victorian food production. An orchard at Burwood East, Harkaway Farm, fresh Victorian fruit for the Melbourne market. Then the pivot, 1889. Abel opens a jam factory in South Melbourne, trading as A. Hoadley and Company. Preserving Victorian fruit into jam. Australian consumers of the 1880s are hungry for preserved food. The population is growing. The gold rush era has ended. Melbourne is the biggest city in the Southern Hemisphere. 6 years later, 1895, Abel Hoadley builds a 5-storey purpose-built jam works at 222 Park Street, South Melbourne. The Rising Sun Preserving Works. The stylised sunrise logo, coincidentally similar to the Australian Army badge that would be instituted in 1902, but with no direct connection, becomes a landmark of South Melbourne working-class industry through the 1890s. By 1901, Abel Hoadley runs 4 preserving factories across Victoria. Workforce up to 200 permanent, up to 800 during seasonal fruit runs. Largest Victorian customer of the Colonial Sugar Refining Company. Then, in 1901 or 1902, Abel Hoadley makes the pivot that defines the next 125 years of Australian confectionery. He buys the former Dillon Burrows and Company confectionery factory near Prince's Bridge on St Kilda Road, South Melbourne, just west of Victoria Barracks. The premises become the Barrackville Chocolate Works. In 1910, Abel sells the jam business to Henry Jones's IXL Cooperative, dropping preserves entirely. Retains confectionery, Hoadley and Sons Limited. 3 years later, 1913, Abel Hoadley registers Hoadley's Chocolates Limited, capital £75,000, and retires the same year. Passes control to his sons, Walter, Peter, Albert, Charles. He dies on the 12th of May 1918 at Bella Vista, Kew, aged 73, cancer. Estate valued for probate at £58,946. Devout Methodist to the end, Central Mission Treasurer, 1895 to 1906. Sold his Burwood East orchard to the Central Mission for £1,000, about £500 below market, to found the Tally-Ho Boys Training Farm. Abel Hoadley never saw the Polly Waffle, never saw Rowntree buy his family company, never saw Nestlé absorb the chocolate empire. Chapter 3. Violet Crumble, 1913. Hoadley's Chocolates Limited is registered in Melbourne. Susanna Hoadley, Abel's wife of 45 years, has a favourite flower, the violet. In her honour, the Hoadley sons introduce a purple box chocolate assortment, violet milk chocolates, purple packaging, violet motif. The colour that would define Hoadley confectionery for the next century. And somewhere in the Barrackville works, between 1913 and 1921, the sons develop what will become Australia's most iconic confectionery product of the 20th century, the Violet Crumble. Here's the honest thing. The 1913 launch date is contested. Company and Wikipedia sources credit 1913. But the Violet Crumble is first advertised in a Perth newspaper in 1921. The Bones department store advertisement at 3p per bar. The trademark is registered in 1923. And the Australian Dictionary of Biography notes that Abel Hoadley retired in 1913 and died in 1918. Probably before Violet Crumbles hit the market, crediting the introduction to his sons. Most likely, Hoadley's Chocolates Limited is registered 1913. The Violet Milk Chocolates assortment launches 1913. The Honeycomb Chocolate Bar is developed in the Barrackville works between 1913 and 1921. By 1923, it is commercial and trademarked. Credit goes to the family. Walter, Peter, Albert, Charles Hoadley. Not to a single day of invention. The honeycomb is a genuine technical achievement. Honeycomb is hygroscopic. It absorbs moisture from the air, which makes the pieces stick together as they cool. Hoadley's engineering solution. Dip the finished honeycomb pieces in a coating of solid chocolate to seal them from moisture. Then wrap the finished bar in a metallized moisture-resistant film. The wrapper was specially developed for Hoadley's by the French firm La Cellophane for this exact application. Chocolate coating plus metallized wrapper equals shelf life. Australian pantries, milk bars, tuck shops can stock the Violet Crumble for weeks without the honeycomb going soft. The bar becomes an Australian domestic icon. Slogan of the early era, nothing else matters. Later, from the 1970s, it's the way it shatters that matters. Snap the bar. Watch the honeycomb break in a specific way. Hear the sound. That is the Australian mid-20th century childhood confectionery experience. Chocolate, honeycomb, shatter, named for Susanna Hoadley's favourite flower. Chapter 4. Barrackville, January 1919. 8 months after Abel Hoadley's death. The Barrackville Chocolate Works, the former Dillon Burrows factory on St Kilda Road, burns to the ground. Per contemporary reporting in the Argus newspaper, the fire consumes the structure within a quarter of an hour. Total loss. Fortunately, no lives lost. The Hoadley family rebuilds. Bigger. On the same South Melbourne footprint. Barrackville, Mark II. Then the 1930s. The Great Depression. Australia's Hoadley Chocolates empire nearly bankrupt. Walter Hoadley, Abel's son, first-generation managing director after Abel's 1913 retirement, cannot stem the decline. Australian consumer spending collapses. Chocolate is a discretionary luxury. Hoadley's cannot sell inventory. The company teeters on the verge of collapse. Enter Albert Hoadley, Walter's brother, as marketing officer. Albert saves Hoadley's chocolates through what the Australian Dictionary of Biography documents as imaginative marketing of candy bars, notably the Violet Crumble, sports cards, collectible trade cards inserted in every Violet Crumble box, cricketers, test teams, Empire Games, VFL footballers, Wild West series, series after series through the 1930s and 1940s. Hoadley's cricketers, 1933, Hedley Verity, George Duckworth. Hoadley's Empire Games and Test Teams 1934, Gubby Allen. The Melbourne Cricket Club Museum holds examples in its permanent collection today. Albert Hoadley discovers what mid-20th century Australian marketing rests on. The chocolate bar is not the product. The collection is the product. Australian kids buy Violet Crumbles to complete a set of cricketers. Australian families buy Violet Crumbles for the sports cards. Hoadley's recovers. Then World War II, 1939 through 1945. Wartime Hoadley management. Charles Hoadley, Abel's son, is chairman of directors. Charles is also an Antarctic explorer and scouting figure, a genuinely colourful Australian family aside. Peter Hoadley is purchasing officer. Albert Hoadley continues as marketing officer. Australian sugar rationing begins in August 1942, £1 per person per week. Butter rationing begins June 1942. Nationwide pressure on all Australian confectioners. But here is what is important to say honestly. There is no verified evidence that Hoadley supplied Australian military chocolate rations during World War II. No named army contract found in Australian archives. No Australian War Memorial Hoadley World War II ration item. What is documented, per the Australian Food Timeline and Wikipedia, is that during the 1940s, sales and profits for the company continued to rise. Australian confectioners kept operating under sugar rationing. Hoadley's kept selling Violet Crumbles to Australian civilians, not to Kokoda, to the Milk Bar, not to the Pacific Theatre, to the Australian suburban childhood. The Barrackville factory on St Kilda Road sat 2 blocks from Victoria Barracks, where Australia's War Cabinet Room operated from 1939 to 45. Atmospheric proximity, but no supply chain connection verified. And in 1947, 2 years after the war ended, the second great Hoadley product launches. The Polly Waffle. Conceived by Hoadley's account supervisor and family friend Mayfield B. Anthony. Waffle wafer, marshmallow filling, compound chocolate coating, purple wrapper, log format. The Polly Waffle becomes Hoadley's second biggest line behind Violet Crumble for the next 62 years. Chapter 5. Bertie Beetle, 1963. The Hoadley Chocolate Factory in South Melbourne has a manufacturing problem. Producing Violet Crumbles generates significant honeycomb offcuts, irregularly shaped chunks of chocolate-coated honeycomb left over from cutting bars to size. The solution? A marketing genius idea. Mould the offcuts into a chocolate-coated beetle shape. Bertie Beetle. Sell for threepence individually, or, even better, bundle them into show bags at Australian country shows and the Sydney Royal Easter Show. By the late 1960s, the Bertie Beetle show bag is one of the most anticipated childhood purchases in Australian country show culture. Hundreds of thousands of Australian kids per year buy a Bertie Beetle show bag at the Sydney Royal Easter Show. Similar volumes at Melbourne, Brisbane, Adelaide, Perth, agricultural shows. By 1970, Hoadley's Chocolates is ranked one of Australia's top 2 chocolate houses, alongside McRobertson's, which owned Cherry Ripe and Old Gold, before selling to Cadbury in 1967. Melbourne is the Australian chocolate capital of the 20th century. Hoadley's product line by 1970 included Violet Crumble, Polly Waffle, Bertie Beetle, White Knight, Tex Bar, Min-Tex Bar, Clancy Bar, promoted via sponsored radio readings of Clancy of the Overflow on Australian commercial radio stations 2HD, 2UW, 3UZA, 4BC. Plus luncheon, Crumblettes, Lady Beetle, Arctic Mints, 5-Star Bubble Gum, Jersey Toffee, Creamy Toffee, Chewing Nuts, Nutty Bar. 16 product lines, all in Australian pantries, milk bars, show bags, tuck shops. All manufactured in Melbourne, Adelaide, Sydney by Australian workers under Australian family ownership. Then the 1960s financial strain begins. Australian confectionery competition intensifies. Cadbury's 1967 acquisition of McRobertson's brings global scale to Hoadley's biggest domestic rival. Nestlé Australia is growing its Australian market share. Rowntree Mackintosh of York, England, is looking to expand into Asia Pacific. Gordon Hoadley, Albert's son, managing director since about 1962, faces the 4th-generation succession question. Continue operating a mid-cap Australian chocolate house alone? Or sell to a larger international parent that can bring scale, distribution and capital? Chapter 6. Rowntree, 1972. Gordon Hoadley, 4th-generation Hoadley family, presides over the sale. Rowntree Mackintosh of York, England, purchases Hoadley's chocolates. The Australian company becomes Rowntree Hoadley Limited. Rowntree had bought France's Menier chocolate in 1971. Track record of overseas acquisitions. Hoadley's in 1972 is Rowntree's Australian entry point. Purchase price not preserved in accessible sources. Named individual Hoadley family sellers not preserved in accessible sources. Research gap. The Hoadley family sale documents from 1972 are, so far, not in the public record. Under Rowntree Hoadley Limited, the product line is rationalised. Some minor Hoadley lines dropped. Some new items, often non-chocolate, added. But the flagship products survive. Violet Crumble continues at the Adelaide Carrington Street factory near Surferland Street corner. Polly Waffle continues at the new Campbellfield plant in northern Melbourne. Bertie Beetle continues in the country show bags. The South Melbourne factory near Prince's Bridge, Barrackville, Mark II, rebuilt after the 1919 fire, is by the late 1970s under pressure. Rowntree Hoadley invests heavily in the Campbellfield plant, extending it in 1977 for the increased product lines. Production begins to shift north from South Melbourne to Campbellfield. Then, around 1983, the original Barrackville South Melbourne factory is demolished. The land becomes part of the Southbank redevelopment project, riverside restaurants, offices, apartments, cultural facilities. The birthplace of the Hoadley chocolate empire, where Abel Hoadley bought the Dillon Burrows factory in 1901, is scraped clean. No plaque, no historical marker. By the mid-1980s, Rowntree Hoadley's Adelaide Carrington Street factory is also winding down. Large-scale workforce redundancies. Non-chocolate lines relocated to Campbellfield. By the time of the 1988 Nestlé takeover, Adelaide has ceased operations entirely. 16 years of British ownership. Rowntree Hoadley kept the products alive on Australian shelves, but consolidated the manufacturing footprint from 3 factories to 1. The Hoadley name, still on Australian shelves via the Rowntree Hoadley trading name, was no longer an Australian family company. It was a subsidiary brand of a British confectionery multinational. Then, the 13th of April, 1988. The Nestlé phone call. Chapter 7. 13 April 1988. 13th of April 1988. London, England. 9:15 in the morning, London time. Swiss confectionery rival Jacobs Suchard launches a dawn raid on the London Stock Exchange. By 9:15 a.m, before most city institutional traders have finished their coffee, Jacobs Suchard has bought 14.9% of Rowntree Mackintosh. Britain's largest independent confectionery company, world's 4th largest chocolate manufacturer with 7% global market share. Rowntree Mackintosh chairman Kenneth Dixon, Yorkshire industrialist, career Rowntree employee, receives the news at York headquarters. He picks up the phone. He calls Helmut Mocher, Managing Director of Nestlé SA, Vevey, Switzerland. Nestlé has never before launched a hostile takeover in its 120-year history. But Nestlé is the world's largest food company and can outbid Jacobs Suchard. Ken Dixon asks Helmut Mocher to be Rowntree's White Knight. Helmut Mocher agrees. Over the next weeks, Nestlé assembles the largest foreign takeover of a British company in history. Nestlé's opening bid values Rowntree at £2.1 billion. Nestlé increases and wins. Final purchase price £2.55 billion. Some sources report £2.56 billion, or approximately 4.5 billion United States dollars. Largest foreign takeover of a British company in British corporate history at the time. Rowntree Mackintosh in April 1988 operates 25 factories in 9 countries, employs 33,000 people worldwide, including 16,000 in 8 United Kingdom operations. Group turnover £1.4 billion. UK and Ireland 40% of revenue. Australia, Rowntree. Hoadley operations at Campbellfield, plus residual Sydney distribution, is one line item in the global portfolio. A small line item. Australia is not the reason Nestlé is spending £2.55 billion. Australia is a rounding error attachment to the deal. Nestlé of Vevey wins the takeover. Rowntree Mackintosh brands are folded into Nestlé Rowntree, a transitional brand name, then simply Nestlé. The Hoadley name, which had survived the 1972 Rowntree acquisition as Rowntree Hoadley Limited, disappears from Australian corporate identity. Nestlé Australia establishes its permanent Australian headquarters at 1 Homebush Bay Drive, Rhodes, New South Wales. Portfolio rationalisation begins. In one Swiss boardroom decision, the ownership of every Hoadley Australian confectionery product, Violet Crumble, Polly Waffle, Bertie Beetle, White Knight and 11 other legacy lines, passes to Nestlé SA of Vevey, Switzerland. The name Hoadley is no longer on any corporate document in Australia. Chapter 8. Erasure, 1988 through 2009, 21 years. Nestlé Australia operates the former Hoadley brands from the Rhodes, New South Wales headquarters. Violet Crumble continues at Campbellfield after relocation from Adelaide. Polly Waffle continues at Campbellfield. Bertie Beetle continues in the country show Showbags. White Knight, Tex Bar and Mintex continue with slowly declining sales through the 1990s. The brand identity gradually erases. Consumer packaging shifts from Nestlé Rowntree to just Nestlé. The Hoadley name, as the Australian corporate parent that had owned all these brands, never returns to product packaging. In 2009, Nestlé Australia reformulates the Violet Crumble. The new bar is slightly wider, slightly flatter. The honeycomb formula is adjusted. Australian consumers complain that the bar doesn't shatter like it used to. Sales drop. Then, the 23rd of November 2009. Nestlé Australia announces the discontinuation of the Polly Waffle. 62 years after Mayfield B. Anthony conceived it in 1947. Nestlé Australia spokesperson Fran Hernon to the Herald Sun, verbatim, "It's costing more to produce than what we get back in sales. Everybody says they love the Polly Waffle, but the truth is no one buys it today. The time for it has been and gone." A mid-2009 recipe reformulation had made the wafer more sugary and brittle. Consumers complained. Sales dropped further. Nestlé decided to end production entirely. Australian consumers organise. A Facebook campaign, Bring Back the Polly Waffle, grows to tens of thousands of members within weeks. Petitions circulate. Australian nostalgia press coverage runs through 2010, 11 and 12. Sealed original Polly Waffle bars sell on eBay for over $100 Australian. But Nestlé holds. The Polly Waffle stays discontinued for 15 years. Meanwhile, other Hoadley heritage lines fade. White Knight is discontinued in 2016, 60 years after launch. Tex Bar and Mintex disappear. Nestlé also discontinues bagged Violet Crumble in 2010. The Hoadley chocolate empire that once had 15 named product lines is now down to 2 commercial survivors, the reformulated Violet Crumble at Campbellfield and Bertie Beetle at Showbags. And then Nestlé decides to sell Violet Crumble as well. Chapter 9. Violet Crumble comes home. 11th of January 2018. Nestlé Australia announces the sale of the Violet Crumble brand, intellectual property, plant, equipment and manufacturing capability to Adelaide's Robern Menz. Nestlé Australia General Manager Confectionery, Martine Brown, verbatim. The sale of the Violet Crumble brand to Robern Menz recognises that they are well positioned to combine their existing honeycomb manufacturing with that of Violet Crumble. We remain committed to manufacturing our other loved brands, such as Kit Kat, Milky Bar, Allen's and Soothers, here in Australia. Robern Menz Chief Executive Phil Sims, verbatim. As the new gatekeeper of Violet Crumble, we are aware of the responsibility that comes along with owning a brand so highly regarded in the Australian marketplace. Purchase price undisclosed. Robern Menz, Adelaide-based fourth-generation family confectioner, run by Phil Sims and brother Richard, approximately 160 staff, existing fruit chocks and substantial existing honeycomb manufacturing business, becomes the new Australian custodian of Australia's most iconic chocolate bar, the physical logistics. Nestlé had invested $8 million Australian dollars in Campbellfield Violet Crumble production in 2017, just 1 year before selling. Robern Menz relocates production to Adelaide over 2018. Deal creates approximately 30 new Adelaide manufacturing jobs. South Australian State Government provides $1.65 million Australian dollars in grant and loan support. Premier Jay Weatherill announces the deal, $750,000 from the SA Future Jobs Fund, plus $900,000 from the Investment Attraction Agency. Production restarts in Adelaide at the Robern Menz Glind facility on the 10th of October 2018. Robern Menz invests $4 million Australian dollars in a factory refit. Production volume increases 37% at Glind. Bagged Violet Crumble, discontinued by Nestlé in 2010, returns to IGA supermarkets in March 2019. For the first time since the mid-1980s, when Rowntree Hoadley wound down the Carrington Street Adelaide factory, the Violet Crumble is again manufactured in South Australia. Under Australian family ownership, by Australian workers, using an honest commercial revival. One Hoadley heritage product came home. Then the following year, 2019, Robern Menz signs a second deal with Nestlé. Nestlé Australia, acquiring the Polly Waffle brand rights. Nestlé Australia Business Executive Officer Confectionery Chris O'Donnell, verbatim. We are very excited about the idea of Polly Waffle coming back. Despite its absence from market, it still has a loyal following. Equipment moves from Campbellfield to the Robern Menz Glind facility Adelaide. Announced relaunch date 2022 or 2023 at latest. Australian consumers celebrate. The Polly Waffle is coming home. Chapter 10. Bites. But the Polly Waffle revival hits problems. COVID-19 border closures from 2020 through 2021 prevent the Robern Menz development team from travelling to source and test the critical wafer marshmallow chocolate manufacturing equipment. Delays accumulate. 2022 slips, 2023 slips, then the 22nd of April, 2024. Robern Menz relaunches Polly Waffle, but not as the log bar, as Polly Waffle Bites. Small chocolate-coated wafer marshmallow pieces. Different format, different taste, different consumer experience entirely. Robern Menz CEO Phil Sims explains, verbatim, the original bar would require even more time and cost, without the guarantee that it would have the same quality that consumers remember. The commercial reality. Reproducing the original Hoadley Polly Waffle log, the exact 1947 Mayfield B. Anthony recipe, the specific marshmallow density, the compound chocolate coating consistency, is technically challenging and commercially uncertain. Robern Menz launches Bites as a market test, a commercially viable Polly Waffle branded product that Robern Menz can actually manufacture in Adelaide. Australian consumer reception is savage. Productreview.com.au aggregates a 1.3 out of 5 rating from hundreds of Australian reviewers. Representative reviews verbatim from Product Review. As someone who had the real Hoadley's Polly Waffle in 60s, 70s, I can say this is nothing like it at all. And the only thing they have in common with the Polly Waffle bar is the name, do not recommend. The Polly Waffle has come home in name, but not in bar. The heritage log, the 1947 Mayfield B. Anthony original, sits in the memory of Australians born before 1990. Nowhere else. The 2024 Bites are the new commercial product. The two are not the same experience. Robern Menz did what was commercially possible, not what was consumer emotionally desired. That is an honest commercial call. But it is not a heritage restoration. It is a brand name preservation exercise inside a modern manufacturing envelope. The Hoadley brand has now completed the full Nestlé cycle. Acquired 1988, discontinued 2009, sold 2018, relaunched imperfect 2024. Australia's first chocolate empire, after 135 years since Abel Hoadley's 1889 South Melbourne jam works, has ended not in a factory closure but in a 1.3-star Bites revival. Chapter 11, Southbank, 2026. Walk to Southbank, Melbourne. Riverside precinct along the Yarra. Restaurants, cafes, apartment towers, the Australian National Academy of Music, the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra rehearsal spaces. Casino, convention centre. Where 222 Park Street once stood, Abel Hoadley's 1895 Rising Sun Preserving Works, the 5-storey purpose-built jam factory that employed 800 seasonal workers at the turn of the 20th century, a mixed residential commercial precinct. No plaque, no historical marker, silent for over 40 years. Where the 1901 Dillon Burrows chocolate factory once stood, the Barrackville Works, rebuilt after the 1919 quarter-of-an-hour fire, demolished around 1983 for Southbank redevelopment, also Southbank precinct, also no plaque, also silent. The birthplace of Australia's first chocolate empire is gone, physically, corporately, institutionally. Meanwhile, at 1 Homebush Bay Drive, Rhodes, New South Wales, Nestlé. Australia headquarters continues to run KitKat, Milky Bar, Allen's, Soothers, not Hoadley products anymore. Meanwhile, at Campbellfield, Northern Melbourne, the 1970s Nestlé chocolate factory, still operating, still making other Nestlé products. Not making Violet Crumble anymore. That moved to Adelaide in 2018. Meanwhile, at Robern Menz Glynde, Adelaide, Violet Crumble production. Under Phil Sims's 4th generation Adelaide family ownership. Approximately 30 workers on the Violet Crumble line. Australian-owned, Australian-made. Still using compound chocolate over honeycomb. Still shattering with the specific sound Australians remember from mid-20th century childhood. Still named after Susanna Hoadley's favourite flower, 113 years after her sons founded Hoadley's Chocolates Limited. Meanwhile, at Vevey, Switzerland, Nestlé S a global headquarters. Continues to grow, continues to buy and sell food brands across the world. The Hoadley chapter is closed in the Nestlé portfolio history, and meanwhile, at every Australian country show, every Sydney Royal Easter show, every Melbourne show, every regional Australian confectionery aisle, Bertie Beetle still sells, still shaped like a beetle, still made from honeycomb offcuts, still 6 for the price of about $5 Australian in a show bag. Now made in New Zealand. The last Hoadley chocolate empire product still on Australian shelves that traces continuously to Abel Hoadley's 1901 pivot to chocolate. The last physical continuity with the Sussex-born jam maker who arrived on the Essex in 1865 with a Methodist work ethic and an East Sussex baker's training. Every kid in Australia over the age of 6 knows Bertie Beetle. Almost nobody knows the name Hoadley. Lesson 1. The company was erased before the factory was. Industrial South has now told 41 Australian factory stories. Chrysler Tonsley Park, Nissan Clayton, Ford Broadmeadows, Clean-Made Cleveland, Queensland, Franklin Caravans Wagga Wagga, Arnott's Homebush, Hills Edwardstown, Halverson Bobbin Head. In every one of those stories, the death was physical, factory closed, workers laid off, site demolished, then the brand persists as a residual marketing asset held by a foreign owner. Hoadley's is different. The physical Hoadley factory in South Melbourne, the birthplace at 222 Park Street, the Barrackville Chocolate Works, was demolished in 1983 for the Southbank redevelopment. Before Nestlé bought Rowntree Mackintosh, before the 1988 acquisition, before the Polly Waffle discontinuation. Before Violet Crumble was sold to Robern Menz, the factory was gone first. The brand identity outlived the factory by 25 years. From 1983 to 2009, the Hoadley product stayed on Australian shelves, while the birthplace factory was Southbank Apartments. Then the brand was erased in stages. From 1988's Nestlé Rowntree corporate rebranding, through 2009's Polly Waffle discontinuation, through 2018's Violet Crumble divestment, through 2024's Polly Waffle Bites imperfect relaunch. Read that again. The factory was demolished first. Then the brand was erased across 4 decades. When an Australian confectionery empire is absorbed by a Swiss multinational, the physical infrastructure often disappears before the corporate identity does. The badge lingers on packaging as a residual asset even after the factory is a memory. The consumer keeps buying the bar. The Swiss holding company keeps collecting the margin. The Australian corporate parent that used to run the factory is a footnote in the Rowntree acquisition history. Hoadley shows how completely the erasure can be finished. Not in one moment. In 4 decades of quiet corporate consolidation. Rowntree in 72. Nestlé in 88. Polly Waffle discontinued in 09. Violet Crumble sold in 18. Polly Waffle Bites in 24. Each individual step is a legitimate commercial decision. The cumulative effect is total erasure. Lesson 2. Small bars can't compete with global portfolios. Hoadley's chocolates in 1972 had approximately 15 product lines, sold across Australia, generating modest profits. Approximately 500 to 1,000 Australian workers across Melbourne, Adelaide, Sydney factories. Rowntree Mackintosh in 1988 had 25 factories in 9 countries and 33,000 employees. Nestlé SA in 1988 was the world's largest food company. Ted Pretty's Hills Limited in 2012 had 28 businesses. KKR's Arnott's in 2019 sat inside a $200+ billion United States dollar global private equity portfolio. The pattern holds across all industrial South stories. When an Australian consumer brand reaches maturity, 80 to 100 years of family ownership, market saturation, and product line breadth, the mathematics of global consumer goods force a decision. Either invest tens of millions to compete with Cadbury, Nestlé, Mondelez, Mars on a global scale, or sell to one of them and retain the Australian brand as a marketing asset inside a larger portfolio. Hoadley's chose the second path in 1972. Gordon Hoadley presided over the sale, rational family succession decision under mounting competitive pressure, not villainy, just calculus. Rowntree Mackintosh chose the same path in 1988, inviting Nestlé's White Knight bid rather than being taken hostile by Jacobs Suchard. Ken Dixon called Helmut Mocker because he calculated that Nestlé ownership would be less disruptive to Rowntree operations than Jacobs Suchard ownership. Rational chairman decision under hostile takeover pressure. Not villainy, just calculus. The global confectionery industry consolidates around 5 or 6 multinational players. Every family Australian chocolate brand, McRobertson's absorbed by Cadbury in 1967, Rowntree Hoadley absorbed by Nestlé in 1988, Kraft Australian operations absorbed by Mondelez, is now a subsidiary of a global multinational. Robern Menz is the exception, not the rule. And Robern Menz can only compete because Adelaide state government support, a specific brand heritage nostalgia angle, and Australian consumer memory for Violet Crumble create a defensible niche. The default outcome for Australian consumer brands at scale is Swiss, American, or British ownership. Family Australian ownership is preserved only by state-supported nostalgia strategies, or by never selling in the first place, like Cooper's Brewery and Akubra under their current family ownership structures, or by Australian buyback, like RM Williams' return to Australian ownership through Twiggy Forrest's Tatarang in 2020. Lesson 3. Sometimes the bar comes home, sometimes only the name does. Robern Menz's 2018 Violet Crumble acquisition succeeded. Adelaide manufacturing, Australian ownership, approximately 30 new jobs. State government $1.65 million in support. Original recipe substantially preserved through the honeycomb and compound chocolate manufacturing chain. Australian consumer reception positive. The Violet Crumble came home, for real. Not as memory, as bar. Robern Menz's 2024 Polly Waffle Bites relaunch struggled. Different format, different recipe. Aggregate 1.3 out of 5 on product review. Australian consumers pointed at the difference between the 1947 Mayfield B. Anthony log and the 2024 Robern Menz Bites and said publicly on Australian review sites, "This is not what we remember. The Polly Waffle came home in name only." There is a simple rule at work here. When a Swiss multinational sells a heritage Australian confectionery brand back to an Australian buyer, the brand equity survives if the physical product survives with it. If the underlying manufacturing chain can be reconstituted, with the same equipment, similar recipe, comparable quality, the revival works. If the product has to be redesigned to fit modern Australian manufacturing economics, the revival fails commercially even when the name returns. Bertie Beetle survives, but is now made in New Zealand from Violet Crumble honeycomb offcuts. Not Australia. Product continuity, yes. Country continuity, no. Violet Crumble survives because Robern Menz's existing Adelaide honeycomb manufacturing infrastructure could absorb the Nestlé recipe with minor adjustment. Product continuity, yes. Country continuity, yes. Polly Waffle failed to survive as the original bar because the 1947 Mayfield B. Anthony recipe requires specific wafer marshmallow chocolate manufacturing equipment that could not be commercially replicated in 2024 without significant additional reinvestment. Product continuity, numbered country continuity, in Bites format, yes. The pattern will hold for other Australian heritage brands as global multinationals continue portfolio rationalisation. Some products can come home. Others come home only as memory dressed in original packaging. The Hoadley Empire, Australia's first chocolate empire, founded by Abel Hoadley in South Melbourne in 1889, absorbed by Rowntree in 1972, absorbed by Nestlé in 1988, partially revived by Robern Menz in 2018, is now 3 products across 2 countries under 3 ownership structures. Violet Crumble in Adelaide, Bertie Beetle in New Zealand, Polly Waffle Bites in Adelaide. The badge lives. The empire is history. £2.55 billion. Vevey, 1988. The Violet Crumble came home. The name Hoadley did not.